Matthew stood by the door with his suitcase packed and ready to leave. He turned to me with that familiar expression, serious and a bit nervous, but with a hint of anticipation, as if he were about to make an incredibly significant proposal. After 8 years of marriage, I knew his face like the back of my hand. Despite everything, his words surprised me. "I wouldn't mind if you joined me in Paris," he began cautiously, as if testing the waters. I was astonished. Paris, the city I had dreamed of so many times but never imagined visiting so soon. Ideas danced in my mind like a butterfly caught in a spider's web. Paris, with its ancient streets, bridges, and bustling parks, presented itself as the perfect backdrop for everything and a fresh start. Although this trip wasn't about us or me, it was a new professional journey for Matthew. Once again, I found myself in a significant meeting, aware that the invitation came more from a sense of obligation than a genuine desire to share moments with me. A subtle irritation, almost like resentment, took hold of me. Matthew had always been a man of great aspirations, constantly immersed in his initiatives and career path. I admired him for it, but now I perceived a growing separation, as if I were on the shore while he ventured deeper into the ocean, fascinated by his aspirations and projects. "I am not sure about this," I said, feeling my voice weaken as if losing confidence in my own words. His gaze, though soft, reflected a touch of disappointment. "It's only for a few days. I thought you'd like to see Paris," he said, his voice filled with understanding. I sighed, trying to organize my thoughts. "Of course, I want to see Paris, but not like this. I don't want to be just an accompaniment to your important event, like an ornament in your life. I long for a real trip where we can be ourselves, away from your endless meetings and phone calls." "This isn't the best time," he finally admitted. "I need to sort out some things here." It was a lie deep down. I knew it wasn't about the tasks he had to complete, it was about us, about the distance between us that I had felt more intensely recently. Matthew looked at me attentively, as if trying to decipher my thoughts, but I struggled to maintain my calm. Finally, he smiled, but the smile was tense. "I understand," he said, his voice heavy with something that sank like a stone to the bottom of the river. He turned towards the door, and I watched him leave, feeling a slight relief mixed with a sense of emptiness, as if I had let something important slip away. Matthew left, and I was alone with my thoughts and a growing emptiness. For the first time in a long time, I felt the walls of our house beginning to close in on me. I felt a pang of anxiety, something warm and bitter inside me. Matthew had gone, and it seemed like something important had gone with him, as if a small crack in our marriage had begun to widen slowly but inevitably. I looked out the window and saw my reflection, a 29-year-old woman, tired, a little lost, but still alive inside. I saw in her eyes a longing for something that seemed long forgotten. That's when I realized I needed to find myself before losing something important in this mundane routine. The afternoon descended slowly over the city, flooding the streets with a soft golden light. I sat in the kitchen, watching the long shadows cast by the trees, listening to distant voices filtering through the open window. Matthew had only been gone a few hours, but it felt like days. The house without him suddenly felt strange, unfamiliar. I picked up my phone and, without knowing why, began scrolling through photos of us together on vacations, trips, happy faces, moments that once seemed so significant but were now just memories. Something inside me stirred like the stale air escaping from an old trunk, a feeling I wanted to escape. I left the phone and went to the kitchen, deciding to make some tea. But even this simple action seemed somehow empty and meaningless. As I poured the tea into a cup, my phone suddenly vibrated. My heart tightened for a moment, thinking it might be Matthew, but when I looked at the screen, I saw Grace's name. Her voice sounded animated, as always, a bit bright. "I was thinking about you. How are you doing? Is everything okay?" she asked. "I'm fine, Grace. And you?" I replied, trying to infuse a little security into my voice. "Brilliant. I was wondering if you'd like to go out tonight. There are things I'd love to share with you tonight," she said, pausing and paying attention to my question. I found myself questioning what I truly wanted deep inside. Two desires clashed: to seek refuge under a blanket and leave everything behind, or to flee the house in search of an escape from this emptiness. "Tonight, you definitely need to get out of the house, Grace. Please don't say no." "It looks like that," she said, her words resonating within me. She always had the ability to make me come out of my shell. I sighed, and after a moment of meditation, I replied, "All right. Where would you like to go?" "There's a club downtown tonight with a literary poetry reading. It's something different, and I'm sure you'll love it," she suggested. I rolled my eyes. A poetry reading was the last place I wanted to find myself. But maybe that was exactly what I needed, something new, something unpredictable. "All right, where and when should we meet?" I asked. "In an hour at my place. I'll pick you up. Don't worry, you won't regret it," she assured me, her voice filled with evident relief. I hung up the phone and felt my heart start to beat faster. It was just an outing to a club, but at that moment, it felt like I had accepted something much bigger. I walked around the room, wondering what to wear and if I even had the energy for such an adventure. When I arrived at Grace's house, she was already waiting outside, smiling. We got into her car and headed downtown. I noticed how her eyes sparkled and how the energy around her was almost contagious. She talked about a poem she had read recently, but I couldn't concentrate on her words. My gaze wandered between the city lights, and suddenly, I felt like I was beginning to thaw, like a piece of ice melting under the sun's rays. The club was cozy, with soft lights and tranquil voices filling the space, creating a special atmosphere as if the whole world had slowed down, leaving only poetry and thought floating in the air. Grace guided me directly inside, finding a cozy corner on a soft sofa, and offered me a cup of tea. Then I saw Lucas standing by the bar, charming with one of the guests. His face glowed with a smile, and his eyes sparkled under the soft light of the lamps. As Grace noticed my gaze, she smiled and exclaimed, "There's the owner of this place. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for many years. Let me introduce you." I tried to protest, but Grace was already leading me towards him. And suddenly, my heart started beating strongly as we approached. He turned to us, and his gaze fell on me. A genuine smile lit up his face, and his eyes sparkled with a unique spark. "And who do we have here?" he asked. "This is my friend Sophia," Grace introduced me. "A pleasure to meet you, Sophia," he said, extending his hand. When our hands touched, I felt a slight shiver run through my body. It was an unexpected moment, and I couldn't explain why. His eyes looked directly into mine, and in that gaze, there was something more than a simple greeting. I felt like the world around us was slightly shrinking. "A pleasure to meet you, Lucas," I replied, trying to maintain my calm, but my heart was still beating faster than normal. I didn't know then that night would change everything. The evening at the club continued, and I found myself increasingly immersed in this unusual but captivating atmosphere. The people around us read poems, shared thoughts and feelings, and I listened to every word, but my gaze kept wandering towards Lucas. Every now and then, I caught him looking at me from across the room. I felt his presence filling the room with a special energy that I couldn't ignore. Grace, noticing my confusion, smiled from her corner as if she knew something I didn't. When the evening was coming to an end, he approached us with 2 cups of coffee. His smile was kind, but his gaze remained the same. "Did you enjoy it?" he asked directly. "It was fascinating," I replied, searching for the right word. My doubt was clearly manifested in my voice. "I'm glad," he said, looking at Grace and adding, "You needed some fresh air. Would you like to join me? I have something to show you." Grace agreed with such confidence that I had no room to protest. Lucas took my hand, and we left the club. The fresh air enveloped us, impregnated with the scent of rain. We walked through narrow streets while he shared his love for this city, the places that had always inspired him. At one point, we found ourselves in front of a small cafe where, according to him, they served the best coffee in the city. "This is where it all started for me," he said, smiling. "I opened this cafe when I was a student. Poets, artists, and musicians came here. There was something magical about this place back then." I smiled, observing how his eyes sparkled as he talked about this place. We entered, and Lucas, who knew all the employees, ordered 2 cappuccinos. When they brought us the coffee, he looked at me as if trying to read my thoughts. Suddenly, he began with an unexpectedly soft voice, "You seem like someone who hasn't found time for yourself in a long time." That question took me by surprise. His eyes were too attentive, too deep, penetrating my thoughts. I felt like the defenses I normally kept up against strangers were beginning to crumble. "Maybe," I admitted, lowering my gaze to my cup. "Sometimes I feel like life is slipping away." He leaned towards me, his face so close that I could feel his breath on my skin. "I feel the same way," he whispered, his voice sounding like he had known me all his life. But sometimes, a moment is enough to transform everything. I looked up and found myself looking into his eyes, which sparkled with a mix of eagerness and something I couldn't describe. That moment hung in the air as if time had stopped. I didn't know how to react, but suddenly, he moved even closer and kissed me softly. It was a fleeting, accidental kiss but filled with a hidden passion and a slight uncertainty. It seemed like he was trying to gauge my reaction, and my response didn't surprise anyone. I didn't pull away, and in that moment, I felt a new, unfamiliar feeling invading me, as if it were taking me to another world, one I hadn't been in for a long time. When his lips parted from mine, I realized I had been holding my breath. We looked at each other, and there was something in his eyes that both attracted and frightened me. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate, but I couldn't help it," he murmured softly, stepping back slightly. I nodded in silence, feeling my heart beating strongly in my chest. It was difficult to explain my feelings, a mix of confusion, emotion, and fear. It was unexpected and wrong, but at the same time, irresistibly seductive. "It's okay," I finally said, trying to regain control. He smiled slightly, a bit embarrassed, and offered to walk me home. I accepted without understanding why. Inside, feelings swirled, incomprehensible and chaotic. That brief kiss had unleashed something deeply buried within me, something I hadn't known existed. We said our goodbyes, and I watched him walk away, his figure slowly fading in the evening light. I entered the house and, closing the door behind me, felt a wave of emotions enveloping me. That kiss, his words, his gaze, everything had been so unexpected and disconcerting that I didn't know what could happen next. But for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Days passed since that night at the club, but I couldn't stop thinking about that brief kiss with Lucas. The memory was so vivid and real that I found myself constantly thinking about him, his soft smile, and his warm words. I felt like something inside me had changed, as if a small flame had ignited in the darkness of my heart, but I still didn't know what to do with it. I tried to focus on my daily tasks, on household chores, but every time I was alone, my thoughts returned to that moment when his lips touched mine. It was as if that kiss had awakened something that had been buried under the daily routine, and the more I thought about him, the stronger the desire grew. One night, Lucas called me. His voice was calm, but I could sense a hint of contained emotion. "I'd like to see you again," he said. Of course, it doesn't bother you, does it?" I replied, surprised by how easily and quickly I accepted. "Where and when?" "There's a place I'd like to show you," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "An old lighthouse by the coast, not too far from here. The sunsets are incredible." I felt my heart race. A lighthouse sounded romantic and almost unreal. I didn't know what to expect, but something in his invitation attracted me. "That sounds incredible," I replied. We agreed to meet there, and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. I chose a simple dress that I loved for its lightness and freedom, trying not to think about the fact that this was a special meeting. When I arrived at the lighthouse, Lucas was already waiting at the base, leaning against the railing. He looked relaxed, but there was a certain tension in his eyes, as if anticipating something important. "I'm glad you came," he said with a slight note of relief in his voice. "It's good to see you too." We began to ascend the ancient stone steps that led to the top of the lighthouse. As we walked, he shared details about his life, about how this lighthouse represented something more profound for him, not just a place. He revealed to me that he used to come here when he wanted to be alone with his thoughts and experience freedom. When we reached the top, an incredible view of the sea unfolded before me. The sun was setting slowly on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The wind blew through my hair, and I felt something inside me come to life. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Lucas asked softly, his tone almost a whisper, but I caught every note. "Yes," I replied, looking at the horizon. "There's something special here," he said, taking a step forward, his voice soft. His tone was almost a whisper, but I caught every note. "I've been thinking about what you said that night about life slipping away, and I realized it's not just about you. It's about me too." I remained silent, feeling his words resonate in my heart. At that moment, I understood that this man truly saw me, who I was, without pretenses or masks. "You know what's interesting?" he continued, taking another step closer, so close that I could feel his breath. "Sometimes we live without noticing the most important moments. We let them slip through our fingers." I felt my heart start to race again. His words were true. I felt like life was truly slipping away, and this man in front of me was the one who could see that. He leaned in a little closer, his face so close that I could feel the warmth of his skin. "Sometimes, we just need to take a step forward," he whispered just before his lips brushed mine softly. This kiss was different, deeper, filled with emotions and feelings, as if he were pouring all his soul into it. I responded, feeling a warmth blossom in my chest like a flower opening to the sun. There we were, at the top of the lighthouse, bathed in the light of the sunset, and the world around us disappeared. That kiss was genuine, sincere, as if he were trying to convey all the things that words couldn't express. When we parted, I felt my head spin with a mix of emotions. It was so wrong and so beautiful at the same time. I knew that moment would change everything. I couldn't deny my feelings anymore. "I don't know what this means," I said, breathing with difficulty, "but I feel like I can't pretend anymore." Lucas looked at me with understanding, his eyes reflecting the same internal struggle. "You don't have to," he said softly. "Life is too short to waste on appearances." We stood there, enveloped in each other's arms, surrounded by the sounds of the wind and the waves, and I realized that my life was beginning to change. I didn't know where this would lead me, but for the first time in a long time, I felt alive and authentic. After that night at the lighthouse, I couldn't stop thinking about Lucas, his words, his touch, his kiss. It all felt so real and genuine that I found myself constantly thinking about him. I felt a part of me reaching out to him with a new force, but something inside me resisted. I was still married to Matthew, a man with whom I had shared 8 years of my life, a man who at one point had meant everything to me. Matthew noticed my growing distance, asking questions, holding my hand during dinner, looking into my eyes while trying to understand the situation. I perceived his growing unease and his desperate efforts to reconnect with me. However, every time I tried to meet his gaze, a deep sense of guilt invaded me, a burden that made it difficult for me to breathe. I couldn't reveal the truth to him. I couldn't confess that my heart had begun to beat in a different way because Grace was present, as expected. She perceived my internal unease and proposed a walk through the park. We walked along paths adorned with golden autumn leaves, and at the end, I made the decision to open up to her. "Something has changed," Grace began, her attentive eyes studying me. "I can't pretend that everything remains unchanged. Something inside me is calling, but I ignore what it is." That voice she perceived with attention and silence, without interrupting me, just feeling while I tried to explain my state of mind. When I finished, she smiled slightly and said to me softly, "You're just trying to find yourself, Sophia. It's normal. Sometimes we get lost in the routine, in obligations, in the expectations of others. But it's important to understand what you really want." However, how could I discover what I truly wanted? That was the question that haunted me every day, at every moment of the day. And as night fell, I made a decision. I needed to see Lucas and have an honest conversation to understand what he felt. I couldn't keep living in this strange suspended state where each day seemed as real as a dream. I went to the club where we first met. The place seemed almost empty, the soft music filling the atmosphere with delicate jazz notes. When he saw me, he straightened up immediately and smiled. "Sophia, you came," he said, and his voice carried a familiar warmth. "I needed to talk to you," I replied, feeling my voice tremble slightly. I wasn't sure how to start this conversation, but I knew I had to do it. Of course, he gestured for me to sit at a table in the corner, far from curious gazes. When we sat down, he looked at me intently, his eyes studying my face as if trying to read all my thoughts before I expressed them. "What's wrong, Sophia?" he finally asked when the silence became unbearable. I took a deep breath and began to speak. "Lucas, I don't know what's happening between us, but I feel it's more than just friendship. I need to understand what you think about all this, what you feel." He paused for a moment, his expression becoming more serious. "I feel something real for you, Sophia," he began. "But there's a truth I need to share with you." I remained still, waiting for his continuation. There was a latent tension in his voice, and my heart started to race. "What is it that you committed to doing recently?" he asked, looking directly into my eyes. I never intended for our relationship to go this far. I didn't plan this, but now I can't ignore what I feel for you. Those words hit me like a cold wind in the face. Everything around me seemed to darken, and I felt like the ground was slipping away from under my feet. I didn't know what to say, I didn't know how to react. All my hopes and expectations crumbled in an instant. It was as if I had fallen into an abyss, and nothing could stop the fall. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I whispered, unable to hide my confusion and pain. "I was afraid," he replied, his voice sounding sincere. "I was afraid of losing you." "Please help me," I said, my voice filled with desperation. "I don't know how to handle this situation." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I never meant for this to happen." I stood up, feeling my legs tremble as if they were about to collapse. I couldn't stay there anymore, in that club where everything seemed false and unreal. I needed time. I needed to understand what to do next. Lucas didn't try to stop me, he just nodded, his face darkened by pain. I left the club, feeling the cold air hit my face with force, reminding me how hard the truth can be. Everything inside me screamed with pain and disappointment. I realized I was trapped between the past and the future, and now I had to find a path that would lead me to freedom, even if it meant walking through dark shadows. This story will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our revelations. Explore more videos on our channel and keep the excitement going.